Children, you might be too young to remember, but one of the first times you really disobeyed your parents was probably by sneaking food. We have some dear friends whose darling daughter, who was barely able to walk, began sneaking out of her bed every night when everyone else was asleep, and would crawl quietly over to the pantry, down the stairs, climbing on a chair. And over the course of a week, had eaten an entire bag of Ghirardelli chocolate chips. That was story one. Back in Dallas, at the school, when I was teaching, there was a teacher who was giving those little square candy bars, Milky Ways, as prizes. And there was this girl, a 4th grade girl, who you would never suspect deceit. She was a straight shooter. And he noticed that over the course of 4 days, 2 whole bags of these Milky Way squares were depleted. 136 cubed Milky Way bars had been snuck away and devoured by this 4th grade girl. We need to understand food. Even a cursory reading of the Bible will show that food is almost always intertwined in the relationship between God and his people. The garden, Mount Sinai, the wilderness, even the Eucharist. But even outside the front and back covers of the Bible, food is obviously important. Most of our life is the pursuit of food. And we are living in a culture which is both gluttonous and fixated on healthy food. We cannot ignore food and its obvious relationship to our spiritual lives. Our primary text this morning is 1 Corinthians 10, our epistle reading. And our subjects are taken directly from that passage: gluttony, idolatry, and the Eucharist. You probably have never heard that pairing of 3 things: gluttony, idolatry, and the Eucharist. But those are our subjects for this morning, because I think that those are Paul's subjects in 1 Corinthians 10. Paul will show us that gluttony and idolatry go together in the Bible, but that receiving all things from God's hand with Eucharisteo, thanksgiving, leads to joy and peace and faith. What I hope to show you is that food is a symbol for our whole lives. How a glutton treats food is how an idolater treats life. This is why God focuses so much on food in the Bible. But where we will also go is how the Eucharist, which is food, is itself a pattern for life, the opposite of gluttony and idolatry. So we're going to walk through 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul is talking about meat sacrificed to idols. But first, you need to understand the biblical backdrop of food. Time after time, in the story of redemption, the choice for God's people is between God's food and the forbidden food. I'll say it again. Time after time, in the story of redemption, the choice for God's people is between God's food and the forbidden food. In the Garden of Eden, God blessed Adam and Eve with all the fruit from the trees. But he draws a line and he says, but not that food. All the other trees can be offered up in a bloodless sacrifice and taken as a peace offering with God. But this food is idolatry. To eat it would be gluttonous worship of self. The law of Moses placed great emphasis on eating God's food and not forbidden food. God made food central to our survival and central to our worship. In the wilderness wanderings, it is food that is the focus, the locus of Israel's unbelief. God provided for them manna, water, quail even. Yet they continued to long for the forbidden fruit from Egypt. Again, food is not detached from our worship. There's a deep connection between gluttony and idolatry. And so this is why Paul ties together stories about Israel's food failures in the wilderness and meat sacrificed to idols. So let's walk through 1 Corinthians 10. It's on page 201 of your prayer book, if you'd like to follow along. And I'd like you to follow along. So page 201 in your prayer book, it's the epistle reading. If you have a Bible, it's better because it has the numbers. But if you don't, just follow along in your prayer book. 1 Corinthians 10, page 201. All right, in verses 1 through 4, Paul shows us that Israel was given God's food, just like us. Paul says, they did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. This is referring to the manna and the water that God provided in the wanderings in Exodus 16 and 17. Paul says in verse 6 that these things are examples to us. The Greek word is tupoi, where we get the word type. They're types of the Eucharist and baptism. Paul does this to show that Israel was given God's food, just like us. But Paul's next section in verses 5 through 14 describes how the Israelites died in the wilderness because they rejected God's food and were overthrown by their lust after forbidden food. So Paul walks through each instance where Israel was provided with God's food, but rejected it for forbidden food. Verse 6. This lusting after evil things that Paul refers to is a quote from Numbers 11, when the people cried, "We are tired of this manna. Who will give us flesh to eat?" So God sent them quail, and while the flesh, it says, was in their teeth, God's anger was kindled, and he killed, it says, those who, quote, had lusted. Verse 7 in our passage speaks about when Israel lapsed into idolatry with the golden calf. Notice that the text emphasizes that they sat down to eat and drink. Gluttony and idolatry. Verse 9 speaks of when the Israelites tempted God and were destroyed by serpents. Again, this is about food. You look through the Bible, almost all the failings of Israel concerned food in the wilderness. And then we find that food is central to our life as a church. But again, this one's about food, the one about serpents. Numbers 25. When the people complained to Moses and Aaron about the lack of bread and longed for Egypt's food, the cucumbers and the flesh pots, as it says in the King James. What happened? God sent fiery serpents among them. So let it not escape your notice. Paul is talking a lot about food. And he closes this section in verse 14 with flee idolatry. Okay, so why is this important? Who cares about food? What does this have to do with you? The fact is, God places food at the center of nearly everything. In fact, God has taken bread and wine and place them at the very center of the Christian life. This is because we are in the same position as the Israelites. Either we will eat God's food, or we will eat forbidden food. Either we will live a life of faith, or a life of idolatry. In a life of faith, we freely give God everything, and receive back only what He gives. A life of idolatry is like the life of a glutton. We keep things to ourselves, and we eat what we want, when we want. This is why Paul starts to talk about the Eucharist just after your passage in the prayer book ends. I want you to think about the Eucharist for a second, and what it is that we're doing when we offer and receive the Eucharist. We take bread and wine. Why bread and wine? They are the most common things. They represent our whole lives. Everything that we eat, everything that we make, everything that we enjoy is symbolized in a loaf and a cup and lifted up to God as an offering. Now, everything belongs to Him. And then we wait. What's He going to do with it? Will He keep it all to Himself? No. He gives us back the bread and wine, only better. It's transformed into the most precious thing in the world, the body and blood of Jesus. So do this with me. This is the pattern of the Eucharist. Take your hands. We give everything to God. He gives it back. We receive it. And in that receiving, we commune with Him. Paul even says that meat sacrificed to idols, if offered up in Eucharisteo, becomes God's food. So, if you can offer devil meat to God, and God can make it holy, then what can God do with your life if you offer it up to Him completely? The Eucharist is a pattern for life. Whatever falls outside the action of offering up, receiving back, and communing with God falls outside the Eucharistic pattern of life. Adam and Eve fell outside of this pattern. The Israelites in the wilderness did too. And it is only within this pattern of life as sacrifice and gift that we can understand why food is so central to our life with God, and why the glutton is like the idolater. Most people live their lives like gluttons. We guard our time, our money, our pleasure, our future, like a glutton guards their stash of Milky Way cubes. God can't have my life. Not all of it. He might take too much of it. I can't survive off what He gives. I'm hungry for other food. Yet the story of God's people and the action of the Eucharist teach us to offer everything to God and to receive back only His food with thanksgiving. You want to know what Adam and Eve and the Israelites had in common? They were gluttons. They wanted more than what God provided for them. Do you know what the opposite of a gluttonous life is? A Eucharistic life. A Eucharistic life is one that puts everything on the altar. A Eucharistic Christian takes every entertainment, every thought, every aspiration, every dollar, every skill, every possession, every habit, every pleasure, our time with others, our time alone, our mornings, our evenings. You take it all and you knead it into the bread and you mix it in with the wine and you offer it to God. You keep nothing back for your own secret gorging. And when you receive it, all of those things, having already given to God, you give thanks because you have received it from God's hands. And you enjoy it only for His purpose and His glory. God provides. This is a Eucharistic life. So in closing, let us turn our attention to our gospel, the story of the prodigal son, a story which shows how forbidden food can lead us astray, but how God's food can bring us back home. The prodigal son was lured away by the prospect of riotous living. This is gluttony in all its forms. But a famine, notice it's about food again, but a famine hits the land, and his gorging stops, and he begins to crave food, the slop of pigs. He comes to his senses, and what does he remember? Surprise. Food. He remembers the bread from his father's table. And what did he find when he turned away from the empty food of self-idolatry? The Father did not merely give him the bread of the servants. He didn't give him merely the bread of the old covenant. It was better than he could have ever imagined. The fatted calf was the feast. The Eucharistic life is not the drab bread of the servant's table, but the lavish banquet of God's forgiving love in the slain body of Jesus. So we don't have to be nervous about holding anything back. You'll get more than your fair share with God. You don't have to keep anything back to be enjoyed in secret. Do not allow any part of your life to be left out of the bread and wine of this table. Rather, let your whole life be found within the cup of blessing. Let everything that gets you through the day be from God's hand. Everything else, everything that does not come from God's hand, is gluttony and idolatry. Isn't His food enough? Come, church. Let us go up to the Father's house and taste and see that the Lord is good.